What it do, homies? We are here with a donation request. This time we're checking out something a little different for the channel. Tasting history with Max Miller, and we're looking at the history of chocolate chip cookies, depression versus World War II. Well, that's a very intriguing title. Let's go ahead and shut up and turn it up.
Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear aprons. And I can think of no greater hero than Ruth Wakefield, inventor of the chocolate chip cookie. So today I'm going to be baking Ruth's original recipe from 1938, as well as her recipe for making cookies during World War II rationing. Then I can do a side-by-side tasting at the end. Chocolate chip cookies, this time on Tasting History.
You know, I run into a whole lot of odd things reacting on this on my channel. I do consider myself a variety reactor, and never in my days would I thought I would be here, but I must have said that thousands of times.
So there are lots of stories, mostly myths, about the invention of the chocolate chip cookie, but they all agree that it took place at the Toll House Inn in Whitman, Massachusetts, in or just before 1938. 1938 is definitely when Ruth Wakefield, who ran the inn, printed the first recipe in her cookbook, Ruth Wakefield's Toll House Tried and True Recipes. Though she actually called them chocolate crunch cookies, which makes me think that they're going to be crispier than some of the chewy chocolate chip cookies that you can find today. So the recipe says, cream 1 cup butter, add 3/4 cup brown sugar, 3/4 cup granulated sugar, and 2 eggs beaten whole. Dissolve 1 teaspoon soda in 1 teaspoon hot water and mix alternately with 2 1/4 cups flour sifted with 1 teaspoon salt. Lastly, add 1 cup chopped nuts and 2 bars, 7-ounce, Nestle's yellow labeled chocolate, semi-sweet, which has been cut in pieces the size of a pea.
You know, this got me reminding something. I have been asked a bunch of times actually to do like ASMR videos, and I actually had the idea of reading recipes. You know what I mean? I think I did one on a now deleted channel where I tried to start it and I read some directions based off some lasagna. It did all right, but I don't know if it was something I could have continued.
Flavor with 1 teaspoon vanilla and drop ½ teaspoons on a greased cookie sheet. Bake 10 to 12 minutes in 375 degrees Fahrenheit oven. Makes 100 cookies. So this recipe is not
100.
all that different from what you'll find on the back of a
100.
bag of chocolate chips from Nestle Toll House, or as Phoebe says,
Nestle Toulouse.
The major differences are today they don't dissolve the baking soda into water and the nuts are very much optional. Also, you don't have to chop up the chocolate today because now we have chocolate chips which are made expressly for this purpose.
Convenience.
In fact, you can't even get Nestle's chocolate bars anymore. I don't think that they sell them, so you gotta use the chips if you want to stick with the type of chocolate that she was using. Lastly, the size of these cookies is quite a bit different because she says this makes 100 cookies. So they're going to be pretty small because the modern recipe, which is about the same amount of dough, only makes between 50 and 60 cookies. So to make this original recipe, start by creaming the butter in a stand mixer until it's nice and smooth, and then add 3/4 cup brown sugar, 3/4 cup granulated sugar, 2 beaten eggs, the baking soda water, and the vanilla. Then add the 2 1/4 cups flour, which has the salt already whisked in. Mix this on the lowest speed until everything is just combined. And finally, add the cup of chopped nuts, I'm using walnuts, and the 14 ounces of chocolate chips, and mix until everything is just incorporated. Now you can of course do this by hand, but Ruth was using a stand mixer. Hers was a Hobart big stand mixer, but you can also do it by hand. Now the recipe doesn't say anything about chilling the dough, but in interviews, Ruth was very explicit in saying that the dough should be chilled overnight, so I'm going to follow her lead and do that. Now a few years later, the
chilled. I wonder what that does. What's the science? What effects does that have on the end product? Chilled dough. Oh, I guess it kind of makes sense, right? Because when you buy pre-made dough, it is in the frozen now. Well, not frozen now, but you know what I mean.
Recipe had to change quite a bit because of the outset of World War II, or rather,
salmonella. That's why. I guess I kind of knew that.
The recipe had to change quite a bit because of the outset of World War II, or rather America entering the war in 1941-42, because rationing kicked in and it was hard to get some of the ingredients, especially the sugar. Yet there was an effort for home bakers to send these cookies by the boxful as care packages to the men on the front. As this ad states, "Dear Mom, the boys will make you an honorary general if you'll just send us more Toll House cookies." So what's a 1940s housewife to do? Well, luckily this ad also provided a recipe for Toll House cookies without sugar. So to make those, you just need to replace a few of the ingredients. You replace the butter with 1 cup of shortening, and replace the sugar with 3/4 cup strained honey and 3/4 cup maple syrup. The rest is pretty much the same. Start by creaming the shortening, honey, and syrup together, then
I have a question. Why? I mean, I see, send them cookies and everything, but surely there was other alternatives that you can send them instead. I'm thinking that maybe it was just a ploy or something to keep the housewife, because back in that day, women didn't have that many rights, and most of what they can do was, because of just because of the way that the world was there. You had your typical housewife that would take care of the house and take care of the kids while the man went out and work. And I'm guessing they said, you know what? They got all this time on their hands. What can we do to keep them busy? You know what I mean? And this is probably just me thinking way too much about this, to keep them busy and keep them in their roles per se.
is pretty much the same. Start by creaming the shortening, honey, and syrup together, then add the 2 beaten eggs and 1 teaspoon of vanilla. Then whisk together 2½ cups of sifted flour. That's a
You can also kind of see it. Sorry, I know it's a cookie thing, but I guess you can also kind of see it as free labor in a way, right? Kind of putting everybody else to work to feed them. Because I don't know how far chocolate chip cookies can take, but I guess if you're starved, any type of food will work. So kind of because they got to go out there and they got to spend their own money. So it's like a clever way of siphoning materials or siphoning food away from the country, right, without you directly asking for it.
bit more than the other recipe, along with 1 teaspoon of salt and 1 teaspoon of baking soda. By this time, they've totally ditched mixing the soda with water. Gently mix that into the batter and then add the 1 cup of chopped nuts and the 14 ounces of chocolate chips. Again, I'm going to let this dough chill overnight. Now, once they are chilled, the recipe says to drop ½ teaspoonfuls of dough onto a baking sheet. But a ½ teaspoon measured out of dough, that's like 2 chocolate chips. It's just absolutely not enough, and it's going to leave you with far more than 100 cookies. So it's best to do this by weight. They're going to be about 14 grams a cookie or so. The other thing is, while the original dough is very easy to measure out and shape into a ball, the one made with the shortening, that's darn near impossible to measure because it's just so soft and sticky. Even after chilling it for 10 hours, it was still just really soft. You can't shape it into a ball, so I just kind of eyeballed it and plopped it on the baking sheet. Now these are going to be crunchy cookies. They're called chocolate crunch cookies after all, so you're going to expect them to spread quite a bit and get very thin, so leave about 2 inches between each cookie. Also, in later interviews, Ruth Wakefield said that she would press the cookies down, so that's what I'm going to do. Not sure that it's going to matter, but I'll follow her directions.
I think it should help with spacing.
You really can't do that with the shortening version, so just leave them as is. But both get baked in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius. Now, both of these recipes say to bake them for 10 to 12 minutes, and ovens were different back then. I have an old oven. There's a reason I don't use it. They're inconsistent. 10 and 12 minutes, that was too long for me. I ended up going with 9 minutes, and even then, they were still very, very dark. 10 minutes, they were burnt. So just keep an eye on them. You're looking for a nice golden brown color. And while you watch your cookies, let me tell you a little bit about the history of the chocolate chip cookie.
Here we go.
The year is 1938. Ruth Wakefield and her husband Kenneth have been running the Toll House Inn in Whitman, Massachusetts since 1930. And despite being the Great Depression, business was booming, and the inn was always packed with guests clamoring for Ruth's New England cuisine.
Oh my goodness, y'all. Look at those pricings. Filet mignon, $2. Now, I understand, inflation and everything, but still, $1 for some lobster? Oh, man. This is crazy, bro. I like to eat Colorado omelets, at IHOP, cheap restaurant. Used to only cost me like $8. They rose that thing up to $15. Jesus, man. I don't know if I can go back there, but man, that's crazy. That's good. $1? Wow. Okay, we're done with that. We're done dreaming.
Cuisine and delightful desserts. Ruth's menu was no stranger to praise. Restaurant critic Duncan Hines himself said that her Indian pudding was the kind of dessert that makes a fellow wish for hollow legs. Indian pudding being one of the oldest desserts in America,
I don't
made
get
from
that saying.
cornmeal, molasses, egg, and milk, so it's kind of like bread pudding, but made with cornmeal. But even with the inn and restaurant doing so well, Ruth was never one to rest on her laurels, and she was always working on new recipes with her staff to wow her customers.
Y'all let me know if y'all want me to do more reactions to this type of content.
Enter the chocolate crunch cookie. Now, there are many myths about how this cookie was created. Some say that she was actually working on a different cookie and ran out of nuts, so she added chocolate instead, though the recipe also calls for nuts, so I don't quite see how that works. Others say that she expected the chocolate to kind of melt through the entire cookie, making it a fully chocolate cookie. But since she was a trained home economics teacher and had been baking for years, she would have known that that was not going to happen, so that's a silly story. Perhaps the silliest is that the Hobart machine, the stand mixer, was shaking so much that it happened to knock some chopped chocolate off of a shelf into the dough, and she just kept going. It's kind of silly. No, the story is much more mundane than that. It was just that after a trip to Europe, she and her head pastry chef, Sue Brides, decided to come up with a new cookie. But it wasn't until 40 years later that she finally put these myths to rest, and she kind of leaned into some of the mythology of the cookie and of the Toll House itself.
That's interesting. Kind of leaned into it. I guess you can kind of look at it as a way of kind of keeping things alive. You know what I mean? Because I imagine like at that point, people know who she is, know her baking and everything. But if you want to keep your name, you want to keep your status and everything, I know sometimes you will just go ahead and entertain those rumors as long as they're not doesn't involve any type of self-harm or danger to the business overall.
In her cookbook, she says, in August of 1930, Mr. Wakefield and I bought a lovely old Cape Cod house built in 1709 on the outskirts of Whitman, Massachusetts. At one time, it was used as a toll house where passengers ate, changed horses, and paid toll. Nope, that is not true. In fact, it wasn't built until like 1817 and had never been used as a toll house, but it made for a good story. It kind of held on to that colonial history, and they had already painted 1709 on the sign. What was true is that almost immediately after their creation, Toll House chocolate crunch cookies were a local hit. And she didn't try to keep the recipe to herself. She would actually hand out hand-typed cards with the recipe on it to different guests. And one of the first people to receive this card was a woman named Marjorie Husted, a name you might recall from the episode on Betty Crocker, because Marjorie Husted, at that time, for all intents and purposes, was Betty Crocker. And so shortly after coming up with the cookie, it was featured on the immensely popular Betty Crocker radio show. I can remember we hooked up a little radio in the kitchen and stood around listening to Betty Crocker tell about the Toll House and about the recipe for cookies. But what really made the cookie take off was the fact that the recipe was being reprinted in all these newspapers in New England. And in February of 1939, the Boston Globe reprinted it with one minor change. Instead of calling it a chocolate crunch cookie, they called it a chocolate chip cookie.
So they're responsible
now, Ruth's
for
recipe specifically calls for Nestle's chocolate, which at the time was sold in bars. But it turns out she actually wanted to use Baker's chocolate, which was produced not very far away in Massachusetts. But at the time of making the cookie, her wholesaler was out of Baker's chocolate, so she used Nestle's instead, and that turned out to be really fortunate for Nestle, because in 1939, they saw a 500% bump in sales of their semi-sweet chocolate in New England. And so they came and knocking on Ruth's door looking to get her official endorsement. And Ruth says that there were several chocolate companies that came a-courtin', but since she had already written the recipe using Nestle's, that's the one that she chose. And on March 20th, 1939, she gave the company the right to use her recipe and the Toll House name. And for this exchange, what did she get paid? I signed off for $1. Of course, you never see the dollar. Though it said she did receive free chocolate for life, still probably not a great business deal for old Ruth, but how was she to know? Now, as soon as Ruth had given the
That's interesting. Signed off for $1. That kind of strikes me as a person that is in it for the, kind of like when you hear people fighting for a cause, and then they get offered like hush money or something like that to stay quiet about it. It's a different situation, obviously. Here, she's not fighting for anything somebody would be against. If anything, people want more of it. But it's almost as if she felt bad for capitalizing on that too much. I'm guessing, right? She was more in love with the fact that people loved her recipes, and that was enough payment for herself within itself. So $1.
Deal for old Ruth, but how was she to know? Now, as soon as Ruth had given the sign-off, Nestle began
And
printing.
he said, how would she know? So maybe she just wasn't that well versed in business.
But how was she to know? Now, as soon as Ruth had given the sign-off, Nestle began printing her recipe on the back of every semi-sweet chocolate bar, and soon they realized that the only reason people were buying this chocolate was to make it into the cookies, so instead of having to chop it up, they scored the chocolate bar into 160 tiny little pieces, and then in December of 1940, they figured, well, let's just break them up in the factory, and they introduced the teardrop-shaped chocolate morsel. What with all of American manhood from 6 to 60 clamoring for cookies with small bits of their favorite flavor, chocolate, flecking them throughout, this simple device is a boon to the hurried homemaker. No more sitting around having to break up.
The accent that he's using, tell me something. Is that the transatlantic accent, which was kind of a mix between English and British? To my knowledge, people had to be trained in this because radio frequencies couldn't capture low end of the spectrum, of the frequency spectrum, kind of like my low end voice, right? Most of it wouldn't be heard on old radios and broadcast movies and stuff like that. So they had to talk with a very distinctive voice, and that was the transatlantic voice. Now, that might be the very, very basic understanding of it, but I believe that's the type of accent he's speaking in right now.
Simple device is a boon to the hurried homemaker. No more sitting around having to break up chocolate into tiny little pieces, because the chocolate morsel or chocolate chip was here to stay. But in World War II, even the company sometimes had trouble getting a hold of sugar, so they'd had to make some alterations to the chocolate chips, which made them very, very hard to eat. One executive even admitted that people had complained of chipping their teeth on the chocolate chips. But regardless, chocolate chip cookies became one of the most popular baked goods to be baked at home and then sent in care packages to the front. Now that Nestle's semi-sweet chocolate is harder to get because so much of it is going to the fighting forces in emergency and combat rations, put it to the best possible use. Make a batch of these golden brown, crunchy Toll House cookies and send them to that soldier boy of yours.
Okay, so to scratch what I was saying earlier, it was because it was hard to get. And I'm guessing it's because, they couldn't necessarily put like hey, you can't buy any chocolate. They still needed to make it readily available to the public. So,
As it said, much of the chocolate that America was producing at the time was already being sent overseas in the form of the D ration. Though much of these chocolate bars were of a lower quality and tough to chew, so a home-baked chocolate chip cookie, even if it was a few weeks old by the time it got to you, was definitely preferred. This is probably why they became so popular, because as people started coming back from World War II, they associated good feelings with this chocolate chip cookie. This led to multiple companies putting out their own version of chocolate chips, and in the 1950s, Nestle introduced a Toll House cookie mix. This was followed by them and Pillsbury making a completely pre-made cookie dough served in a tube, which is still the best way to eat it. Like, don't even bake it, just straight out of the tube. Other companies began selling already baked chocolate chip cookies, most famously the 1963 introduction of Chips Ahoy. Now, while chocolate chip cookies have become one of America's most beloved creations, sadly, the location of its creation is no more.
So, store-bought cookies, not baked, chewy, Chips Ahoy. Oh my goodness. See, now y'all done messed up. Now I'm gonna have to go get my own. Oh man, chewy Chips Ahoy is whatever. Oh, that's the perfect recipe for a store-bought cookie, non-bake. Come on now.
Ruth Wakefield and her husband sold the Toll House in the 1960s, but in 1984 it burned down, and today it's a Wendy's. But the Toll House legacy lives on in Massachusetts, and in 1997, the state legislature decided to name a state cookie, an official state cookie, and of course, the chocolate chip cookie was going to get it, except that the governor, William Weld, was a fan of the Fig Newton, which was also invented in Massachusetts. But a state representative and former employee of the Toll House decided that she was going to start a campaign for the Toll House cookie being the official state cookie. And she was smart and got all the kids of the state on board. So they came up with wonderful slogans like, when was the last time your mother baked you a warm batch of Fig Newtons?
Never.
And Fig Newtons are a form of self-punishment. Well, after the results of a phone poll showed that the Toll House cookie was clearly the winner,
that's savage.
William Weld decided to relent and name the Toll House chocolate chip cookie the state cookie, and the Fig Newton got the title of state fruit cookie.
A cookie is just a cookie, but Newtons are fruit and cake.
And the kids were not wrong. You don't really bake Fig Newtons at home, and you definitely do bake chocolate chip cookies at home, as I am.
It checks
out.
out.
The smell is wonderful. So I think it's about time to take them out the oven.
That's
so
nice.
Once they've baked,
Nice
take them out of the oven and let them cool on a sheet for 5 minutes, then transfer them to a cooling rack and let them cool until room temperature. And here we are, the original chocolate chip cookie and their World War II ration-friendly counterpart. So they're definitely smaller than most that you would find today. I guess it's about the size of a Chips Ahoy, but it's also a lot darker. And I think that is not due to time in the oven as much as due to just the brown sugar versus white sugar ratio. But they smell really good, and lots of big chocolate chunks, and lots of nuts as well. Let's give it a go.
Does he have a video on brownies? If he has a video on brownies, that's my favorite baked good out of everything. Dark chocolate. I love brownies. Please tell me he has something on brownies.
Crunchy. I mean, it's a chocolate chip cookie. What's not to like? I wouldn't know that this was any different than the modern version. You know, I mean, it's all the regular ingredients. Not a lot has changed. So maybe it's time to try out the World War II version here, which is considerably more spread out because the dough was just so liquidy. But it's also made it so all the chocolate pieces, you can tell better here,
it's in the middle,
are kind of in the center, and they're all like that. The chocolate chips haven't spread as much. Let's give it a try.
It was definitely crunchy. Chocolate crunch.
So they're softer. They're good. They just aren't nearly as sweet.
It's probably a good thing.
There's like an extra flavor in there. That has to be from the maple syrup. It kind of reminds me of the flavor of like Raisin Bran a little bit, but with chocolate.
I love Raisin Bran.
They're actually quite good.
You hear the crunch. Chocolate crunch.
And the texture it's not as crunchy, but it's really light. They're like almost pillowy. Which would I choose? I'm going to go with the original, I think. It's just a little sweeter. But this, not as bad as I was expecting. I'm surprised, pleasantly so. So now we call these cookies here in the US, but in the UK, they might refer to them as biscuits. And a little while ago, I filmed an episode with the boys over at Sorted Food where I tried several different British biscuits and talked about their history. So I will put a link to that video in the description, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Okay, this was actually more interesting than I thought it'd be. But yeah, like I said, I need to know if he has
long before
a brownies. So let's see if he does. Max Miller brownies. No, figgy pudding. Figgy pudding. I only know that because of Adam Sandler, 8 Crazy Nights, figgy pudding. No brownies. That's a shame, but maybe I can submit a request. Anyways, let me know if y'all want me to do more reactions to the Max Miller. This was very, very pleasantly surprising. That's the end of this video. Dave's out.